edition of the Milan EICMA show, and back here with HTV Blue to discuss the new Yamaha R1, two different models that have been released, the R1S and the R1M. And if I'm not mistaken, these are two, essentially one model is a step up from the other, and one is fully carbon fibered and this one is just a fully faired standard model. And we should probably discuss the merits or demerits of either the bikes.
Yeah, I mean, the standard bike is, or the R1S, I think is what most of us would traditionally understand as a liter bike from the Japanese. It has an ABS plastic fairing around an inline 4-cylinder engine that is held within a twin spar frame. So in that respect, it follows the same pattern that the Japanese have been following since the Suzuki GSX-R 750 in 1985, I think. And largely every Japanese sports bike has followed the same basic principle since. Whereas the R1M is more in the vein of BMW's HP4, or Ducati have always been very good at doing higher spec versions of essentially the same bike. And the interesting thing so far, what we've been able to tell, is that the engines in both models will actually be the same. So there's no extra power you're getting from getting the R1M, but it is the ancillaries that appear to be better electronics. There is data logging availability with the higher spec machine. And what was the other item? Oh, the carbon fiber fairing, as you say. Oh, and electronic suspension. You know, I should have made a list.
So we have an updated dashboard, and you and I were perusing through some of the photographs earlier, and it appears that this new iteration of the R1 has a striking resemblance to the race bike from here it is, to this bike here, which
the 2000, actually that's down as 2009, isn't it? I think actually, strictly speaking, that was the 2008 model. But aside from that, certainly under the fairings there is a similarity between the current or the replacement R1 that we saw this evening and the frame of the race R1 that Ben Spies was very famous, that sort of released the machine with great fanfare. And you can certainly see a family lineage there.
Now, let's get to the superficial bits first. The cosmetics or the aesthetics of the new R1.
Yeah.
Thoughts, feelings.
My sense over it all, when I first saw the leaked pictures earlier today, I thought, oh dear, what have they done? But on this picture that we have up on screen at the moment, I actually think that it's not a bad design. I like the nose. I particularly like the upper half of the cowl. I think the rake of the windscreen, the surrounds, the blue part there that you're showing to people on screen, I think is a really nice shape. I think the cutout of the ram air in the middle is nice. That echoes the M1 MotoGP bike by Yamaha. I think that gives it a nice family identity. Where I think it falls down a little bit is exactly where you're pointing out now. It's the bulges. The sort of it strikes me they look a little bit like afterthoughts. And I wonder whether the rather fine slit LED lights that are quite hard to see on this picture, but exist between the blue topper part and the white lower part, they will actually light up. And I wonder whether that perhaps then they were decided that wasn't strong enough illumination, and so they decided to add projector lights underneath. But they do look to me like quite a fussy add-on, and almost like they've been jammed underneath. Obviously, this is not the way plastic works, but it looks like they've been jammed into the plastic and made it bulge round where they've put the projectors, and it just
Yeah.
looks a bit fussy to me, really.
Right. There is this kind of when I look at the bike, it's not unappealing, but I have to agree with you. It seems to me like the line just below the inlet here, or just after the inlet here, where these lights go. Uh,
It's awkward, isn't it? Somehow.
well, right, and I'm not sure. I'm not certain, but let me just see if I can zoom in here again. It looks like this black piece is also part of the fairing, but it's just been deliberately blacked out to accentuate the lines or the colors or the placement of where it is.
Yeah.
But this doesn't. It doesn't. It looks good, but it just. I guess it doesn't flow enough or something. Maybe that's just
Yeah.
nitpicking. I think some people are going to think, "Oh, come on, you're just being ridiculous. You're just being ridiculous." Um, it,
They may well do, but I think if we compare, and I can imagine people may be rolling their eyes at this as well, but if we compare to Italians, we always love to compare Japanese bikes to Italian bikes, don't we? But if you compare to the Italian bikes of the last few years, and in fact perhaps of always, I don't think they would put such a fussy detail into one of their designs.
yeah,
They
like you said, I mean, like these lights, and there was we conjectured that perhaps these LED slits were insufficient lighting, and
indeed.
so the round lights, projector lights, whatever they're to be called,
Yeah.
were an afterthought. And I'm just of the opinion, if we're being somewhat anally retentive here about design,
And
that
why not?
it does look like an afterthought. It almost looks like if you've seen the adventure bikes with these these additional external lamps, like they just
Great
kind of, instead
thought.
of
Yeah,
having them
great thought. Yeah.
poking out
It
from
is.
the forks, just tucked them into the cowl there and so forth. But
Yeah.
again, I mean, some people will just say, "Oh, well, I think they look cool, and that's fine," or whatever. And I
Yeah,
suppose,
it always has to be said when we're talking about the aesthetics of a motorcycle. If you like it, I don't want to try and convince anybody that they shouldn't like something that they like. If you like it,
right.
more power to you. Great, I'm glad.
I think at this point we should just probably make a disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect those of the manufacturer, um,
Indeed.
or
Or the
the viewer,
channel.
much less the channel or the viewers. Well, certainly the opinions of the channel, but um, I would say that anybody who's viewing this may disagree with the opinions being expressed here. But this is just an exercise in looking at something and saying I like it or I don't like it, and just giving the reasons why we don't like it. I tend to be somebody who likes lines to flow on the bike, and I would say that this bike looks more compact than the outgoing model. It looks
Visually appears to be, doesn't it? It's
it
hard
looks
to
a little
tell.
slimmer. It looks slimmer than the outgoing model, certainly. And we were also noticing that. Well, I noticed that the seat, and this could just be, this is pure speculation, but based on what I'm seeing, it looks as though they've tapered the seat in closer to the frame because, in fact,
And
this
the
is a
frame itself as well, I believe, or it
right.
appears to be. They appear to have scooped it out to give your knees a more comfortable ergonomic feel, I guess. And of
Hmm.
course, a thinner bike will be easier to control, particularly on track, but on road as well. Will be easier to control than a fat. I mean, if there was one complaint of the current R1, is that you almost have to do the splits to ride the thing. It is enormously wide.
Right.
Young ladies who ride horses will recognise it well. It is it's you need to be good at yoga. Let's put it that way.
Sign me up.
I love the fact, though, if we want to be positive for a moment, I love the fact that the engine is silver. Particularly on the black bike, it really makes it pop. Makes you look at it. Engine. I'm not saying that all engines should be silver, but in this particular design context, I think the silver engine looks great, particularly in the black bodywork and black frame.
Right. I think the black hides this disparity that's going on here that we talked about.
Yeah, some of the fussiness is not quite so obvious, is it?
Right, and it cleaned the monochrome look tends to clean the lines of the bike up a little bit, and of course, I think when you have a single color bike, it tends to hide. Well, it could work both ways. It could either hide a line that you would want accentuated, or it could hide the lines that you don't want accentuated, and so forth. So,
indeed, as a kind of a final thought on the folds and the shapes around the nose. I don't know how can we pop back to the colourful bike, one of the colourful bikes, and have a look at the nose. I mean, that's a great example. Yeah, there just seems to me that there is so much going on there. You've got the blue, you've got the silver, you've got the white, you've got the lights, you've got the R1 legend, you've got the black plastic. There's a lot going on there. I mean, origami and the Japanese obviously are closely related, but it really looks like it takes an origami master to put that together. As someone who has to work on bikes, one of the first things I see when I look at a fairing is how long is that going to take to get off, and that looks very complicated to me.
Yeah, it looks like you have
a lot of different bits.
Well, at least what we can see is there are at least 2 rivets here on the side just below the crank case.
Yeah.
Or the base of the engine here.
Yeah.
And then we're looking at. It looks like we have 2 separate radiators going on here.
Yeah,
we have a larger radiator at the top, and I'm wondering what this business is at the bottom.
I think it will probably be an oil cooler. It's something.
Okay.
It's very frequent on race bikes. If you look at race bikes, they generally have an oil cooler either behind the radiator, the water radiator, or below it, filling up essentially the bottom V shape of the fairing. It's actually the first time I think I've seen it on a road bike, but it's a nice addition, and I think it does draw a link to their M1. I'm a little bit skeptical by some of the claims I saw in tonight's reveal that Valentino Rossi was saying that what they wanted to do was build the M1 but with lights and mirrors, and that's very noble, but I don't think that's what this is. With the best will in the world, it may be a great bike, but I think it's pushing.
We sort of jokingly said, well, if he feels that it's comparable to the M1, then let's, by all means, put the bike on the track and compete in next week's race with it.
Absolutely. See where you're at the end of the race.
Put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. And then
you'll be wishing he's back.
I guess just
happy.
What are we thinking about this exhaust? I'm sorry, but this is just. I always feel like I have proclivities towards violence when I see when I see what's potentially a beautiful looking machine and these trombones sticking out of the side of. I just don't get it. I mean, Kawasaki probably has to be the worst.
Appalling effect. I mean,
perpetrator of these grotesque-looking things that come out of the side of the bike. It's as though they're, they've done. Obviously, they've gone at great lengths at detail to make something that looks aesthetically appealing, and then completely blow it out of the water with this thing sticking out of the side. And we had sort of both concluded that this looks an awful lot like the outgoing GSX-R 1000 or
with the
A
current.
GSX-R exhaust, yes.
Yeah, I mean
Uh,
the GSX-R 1000 currently. I mean, if we get onto the side view of this bike, um, you can kind of see the end canister perhaps a little bit more clearly. Uh, it's a little bit of a shame that we haven't got one without the plastic, but unfortunately at this moment we haven't. But the heat shield, it looks to me that underneath that heat shield, the shape of that exhaust is remarkably close to the GSX-R 1000 that is currently on, which in fairness isn't the worst original equipment exhaust on a motorcycle for sale at the moment. You know, you said about Kawasaki. In fact, actually, all of the original equipment exhausts, to my eyes, are fairly ugly. This is not the worst one, but it's certainly not good. And I can almost hear people itching to want to say, but the first thing you do is throw that away and put an aftermarket exhaust on. But I don't think that should let them off the hook, because they are selling they're not selling a nearly complete motorcycle. They are selling a complete motorcycle to us.
right.
There is a move in Europe at the moment to actually not allow us to update our bikes in any way. So we would have to keep original exhausts.
Right. Well, to be fair to the manufacturer, and obviously costs are always a consideration when manufacturing a bike.
Yeah.
They have to. They're having to comply with a series of different emissions standards.
And certainly, if you look
depending on which country these are going to, and so forth.
Indeed. I mean, and if you look at superbike history over the last decade, up to around 2004, 2005, exhausts could largely be, but for noise, drive-by noise levels, could largely do what they wanted. Unfortunately, once emissions became more and more controlling, I mean, a great example actually is the 2009 Suzuki GSX-R 1000. You know, they went from a reasonably good-looking side-mounted exhaust on the K5000, and then suddenly had these appalling twin dustbins on their 2009 version. And even though they made it out of titanium, so it's, you know, they'll have had to have spent a bit of money on making it out of titanium, I think.
Exactly. So if you're going to spend that much money with componentry and manufacturing, why not pay somebody in R&D to sketch you a exhaust that would conform to the lines of the bike more? You know, but anyway, you know, who knows who makes why they make these decisions? But obviously, I would say that the first and foremost, the decisions are made based on cost. How much is it going? You know, how much are these exhausts going to cost, and the materials and so forth?
And saving a penny per exhaust is probably gives you an accountant somewhere in the bowels of Yamaha a big pat on the back. Maybe even get them a bonus if they save a penny per bike. So,
sure.
You know, I understand that there are these restrictions in place, but it just seems a bit of a shame. And as I say, I don't accept the argument that we're going to, many of us, remove the original exhaust, because it's not being sold as a throwaway item. It is being sold as a complete item. And therefore the exhaust should be suitable and should be acceptable, I guess. Anyway, you mentioned price there, the price of individual components. That brings us quite nicely onto something I am aware is getting you quite heated at the moment, which is the apparent price, purchase price that this will be sold at.
Right. This bike, there's no real confirmation. This is a pure speculation at the point of this particular live cast. But a price of approximately $19,000 US has amended to this new iteration of Yamaha's R1, and look, it's probably a brilliant bike. We haven't gotten any word on what the real specs of the bike are. Apparently it's around a 200 horsepower bike, but I really want to know what the weight numbers are. Have they changed the rake angle of the front? It looks like these brake calipers may be in-house.
They are what used to be called the Yamaha twin spots. Once upon a time, they were right up there with the kind of brakes that everybody wanted. People were taking the twin spots off any crashed Yamaha they could.
And this is just kind of a cue to the viewer or the listener that anytime a manufacturer can keep production of their product in-house, it saves them a great deal of money.
Indeed. Yeah.
To be able to manufacture something in-house as opposed to having to outsource it.
Especially if the design, as in this case, is over 15 years old. These are essentially the brakes that were on the original R1. Great brakes, actually not on the original R1, sorry, on the reissue, the 5JJ model. The original one actually didn't have radial brakes. Mm-hmm. But these are old brakes. They're turn-of-the-century brakes, which is not to demean them. They're great brakes.
They've obviously put braided lines, which is mostly standard on any super sport or super bike these days. One just addressing a final thought about the aesthetics. We were also talking about coming back to the exhaust and meeting the emission standards and so forth, where you have this rather large underbelly.
Honking great collector boxes, I think.
Well, right. It's essentially a catalytic converter because it has to meet emission standards and so forth. And as we've said, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people that are going to remove that and put something that's just aesthetically more appealing and probably try to find an exhaust that sounds halfway decent.
And will save a whole heap of weight as well, of course.
Right. I'm guessing that
heavy things.
There's a company we had mentioned before. The company's called TaylorMade, which makes these really nice exhausts that just conform to the bottom of the bike and clean the lines up near the swing arm and under the seat of the bike, much like the KTM in-house, and of course Ducati's Panigale undertail exhaust. But I think that has been manufactured. If I'm not mistaken, I'm wondering if is it manufactured for them by Termignoni, or is that in-house and Termignoni makes something that's similar to the underbelly exhaust for the Panigale?
Yeah, I think my suspicion, and it is only a suspicion, my suspicion is it's probably not an in-house design, but the Termignoni one certainly looks very similar. It won't be the same, obviously, not least because it makes a much nicer noise with the Termignoni exhaust on it. But if you want to talk about an OEM exhaust, an original equipment exhaust on a motorcycle that looks decent, the Panigale is a great example. Mm-hmm. And I don't imagine that exhaust costs them any more or much more than this will cost Yamaha. Mm-hmm. And which would you rather see on your sports bike? Maybe that's the way to put it, even to cynics that say, oh, well, we just remove them. But which would you rather have as standard? Would you rather have the Ducati Panigale look, or would you rather have this dustbin on the side, or garbage bin?
I'll have to catalog that one in my library. I've not heard it referred to that. Okay. Here we are looking at it's not a cutaway, but it's just the new R1 with the fairings completely removed, and all of the other accoutrements on the bike have been removed so that we can kind of see what's beneath the skin, so to speak. Yeah. And I guess we do see an oil intercooler down there beneath the radiator, the primary radiator, the primary cooling portion of the bike, and it looks like we have the reserve reservoir, which is right up here in the front, and the front fairings acts as a shroud to cover that up.
Which is exactly
Yeah,
where a race bike would put it as well, interestingly.
okay. And then we'd also, to sort of backtrack to the to this 2009 R1 race bike here. There's a great deal of similarities, because one of the things that I noticed on this race bike, just Claire, because I'm not clear on this, and maybe you know something about this that I don't. But when I looked at the R1, the previous iteration of the R1, 2009 to 2014, I guess it is.
Yeah.
We saw a seam here that an additional seam along the frame.
Yeah.
That is not there on this bike, and it's also not there on. What you see here. Here's what I'm talking about. Here's
it is there on this bike. Yeah.
Okay, so if we're looking at this as a something that you would go to the dealer and buy as a consumer, out of the box R1 that's available for mass production, we see on this frame there's two welding seams here on the frame, and if we look at this R1 2009 race bike, we don't see a seam there, or if I'm not seeing this correctly, but I don't.
No, you're right. There isn't a seam on that particular.
Okay, so there's also no seam on this new. This is the new R1 here. There's no seam here, but also you were talking about. Well, I made the comment that we have this sort of C-shaped wraparound shape going on here, which is serves as an engine bracer bracket. But there's a similar design on the MT-09 and the FZ-09. We have this sort of similar shape. If you look at the frame, it has this kind of sort of C shape going on here. That's probably neither here nor there, but it's just something I noticed.
Another thing to perhaps mention is the bulk of the amount of metal. That, I mean, obviously this will be quite thin metal, but the aluminium that is filled in. If you imagine the twin spar going down at the same width all the way down to the bottom, so from the headstock going all the way down below where you keep your feet, if you imagine that the same width, the previous model, the front spar came down as just an individual, I don't know, maybe 5 centimeters wide, coming down, whereas they've actually filled that gap in with metal material now. Which in theory should give you a stronger bracing when you're braking hard in a straight line, but also give you greater flex when you're in the corners.
You know, now that I see this, it just occurs to me as an afterthought. I don't want to digress too far from the topic here, but if we're looking at this, this would make one hell of a sick-looking Streetfighter. Just look at how angry. I mean, look at how angry this thing looks, just with the without those little Christmas balls hanging down below the light there. That is a phenomenal looking front there for a street.
If you could cover the top part, you know, the fairly messy part above the lights, yeah. If you could cover that part with a piece of plastic, maybe.
Hasn't Kawasaki done that with their some similar? I'm more or less kind of I lean towards the classic. When I see a Streetfighter, I kind of like just a single light or some kind of whatever. But this looks kind of cool. I don't like what Kawasaki did with the new Z1000, but again, we're digressing here. You were talking about, back to the R1 here with this frame, this rather large piece of aluminum which is shrouding the upper end of the motor, which is not seen on the previous or the outgoing model. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, again, it comes back to the race bike versus the road bike. When the road bike was released, there was a lot less material between the main spar that comes down and the front engine mount. You can see here at the front where the frame connects, just behind the exhaust downpipes or behind the radiator pipe. You can see where it actually bolts to the end, or where the engine bolts to the frame at the front. The silver bolt there, yeah, exactly. Now, the original cross-plane crank R1 had a single spar that came down, so that came down as a single piece, almost like a big finger, if you can imagine.
So in other words, we're removing all of this material.
All of that is removed, yeah.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the current ZX10, that has this similarly filled in piece with much more metal material in there. Equally, Yamaha's MotoGP bike has this heavily filled in area, and it seems to be something that is learned from racing, and it seems to have been applied to the frame on this bike, which I think essentially is a good move. I like to see, particularly bikes that are supposed to be sports bikes, be influenced by the recent years' racing activities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a nice thing to see, just from an interesting perspective.
So aesthetically, this bike appears to have lost some weight. It looks thinner, but I think that's kind of what I'm waiting to see. I'd like to see the wet weight numbers, not the dry weight, but the wet weight numbers, fully fueled, all of the fluids, etc., and so on. And if in fact it,
I've said to you before, I think dry weights are a revolting thing. I don't think companies should be allowed to get away with them. I mean, we don't list weights. If someone asks you how much you weigh, you don't say, well, I weigh 8 stone without my blood. I mean, it doesn't. You can't do it. You can't say a bike weighs X, Y, Z without fluids, because it doesn't work without fluids.
Right.
It needs its fluids. It needs its fluids to live. So there should be wet weights.
Yep.
And it would be.
And that's really being intellectually honest with the people who are looking to buy these bikes.
Yeah, I think.
I don't see there's any problem, but generally, as a rule, it's anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds worth of fluids that a bike. So when you see a dry weight of a bike, tack on an additional 30 to 40 pounds, and then you have the true, or an approximation of the true weight
I think
of the
that's
bike.
fair. Sometimes it can be a little bit less. I've seen them right down to just a little bit under 25. But as a general rule, yeah, that sort of area is where we're at.
Mm-hmm. But okay, so let's just talk about the thing that the elephant in the room, which is,
we're not talking about the engine.
No. Well, okay, yes. Let's address the let's finally go into the engine, and then sort of like conclude with
price.
This engine versus the outgoing engine, and is this engine any different from the outgoing engine? And what did the gentleman say at the EICMA show? What?
Well, it was interesting. He said it a couple of times, and he changed his wording when he was talking about this. But what he called this engine in his new R1, he called it the CP4. That was the code name he used for just for the engine, not for the bike. Now, the problem is that the CP4 stands for cross-plane inline 4, and it was the code they gave to their 2009 R1 engine. Now, ultimately, that engine was quite a heavy engine and didn't make really the same power as the competitors. What I hope to see with this one is that they had taken the principles of the crossplane, but had vastly reduced the bulk of the engine and hopefully the weight at the same time. And we haven't yet had a definitive answer as to whether they've done that. Certainly, they have said that this engine makes around 200 brake horsepower, which is a lot more than the 2009 to 2014.
That's generally at the crank, and manufacturers generally advertise their horsepower at the crank and not at the wheel.
Which is, again, you're talking about intellectual honesty. I think that's a bit disingenuous as well, because that's not the power that you're going to be able to use. And I think there should be uniformity. I don't mind if they want to start quoting it at the crank, as long as they all quote it at the crank.
Well, it's a psychological thing, and it's also a marketing thing. I suppose it's not illegal for them to say this is how much horsepower the bike has without any degree of specificity as to where that power is.
Indeed.
So when we hear horsepower numbers, and I understand, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's generally when you see horsepower numbers advertised and those horsepower numbers are at the crank, you usually subtract 20% from that, and then you have a round or an approximation of what the horsepower,
you won't be far off,
what power you're actually getting on the tire there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the formula that I'm familiar with anyway. And we always see the dyno runs. For example, there was the MV Agusta F3, and they had the F3 675, which was advertised at 126 horsepower. That happened to be at the crank, and the real numbers were at about 115 or something like that, somewhere in the 100 and teens.
Yeah, that would sound about right. I mean that still puts them at the top of their class, but it's a bit more.
I can hardly wait to talk about that bike. I really we have a whole discussion surrounding the MV Agusta line, the 3-cylinder motorcycles, and that is just an entirely. I'm really looking forward to that discussion. But
it will be a good discussion, no doubt.
Indeed. So there we have it. So I guess the final thought now is, if let's just totally speculate and throw this out there, because I know that the opinions are going to fly everywhere. Oh, you can't say this about the bike. You've not ridden the bike. You know, you don't know. Well, no, and I'll be the first to say here live on my channel that I don't know. I don't know what the real horsepower numbers are. I know what the advertise, but let's just sort of throw this up the flagpole and see how it weighs. Let's say that this bike has 185 rear wheel horsepower. Okay, there's 185 horsepower at the tire, and let's just say that what the outgoing do we have? Can you pull up the number on the outgoing R1 model in terms of weight? Is it around 450 pounds or 460?
Yeah, I think it might even be a little bit more. Yeah, 460, I think.
Can you pull that up really quick?
I will. Yeah, you keep talking. I will get there.
Right. So we're speculating that the outgoing model is around let's say between 445 and 460, somewhere in there. If this bike has, let's just say realistically, maybe 12 more brake horsepower than the outgoing model.
Yeah.
And is around the same weight. I'm guessing because of the frame, it's probably going to be a better handling bike. By looking at it, if I were to guess, that's also complete and total speculation.
Well, you would hope they wouldn't make a step backwards.
Right. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that it's a better handling bike than the outgoing R1, that it's maybe, let's say that it's 15 pounds lighter, and let's say that it's 185 horsepower at the crank. Is it a 19,000 MSRP? Look, and that's the number that's being thrown out there.
Yeah.
Is this a $19,000 bike? I mean, we could also ask the same question of the EBR, and of course the EBR has done brilliantly with their single perimeter zero torsion load brake on the side with 8 pods, I guess is what they're using, and the fuel in frame. That to me is a true technological leap forward, but he's had that design for a number of years now, so it's not something that's groundbreakingly new. But you know, is that a $19,000 bike, or any of these 185 plus horsepower bikes the equivalent of a brand new Toyota Camry? I mean,
Yeah.
is what I have to ask myself.
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? I mean, bikes traditionally have been a cheap way to get high performance. I think you would be hard pushed now to call any of the liter bikes cheap. They all seem to be pushing the expense a little bit. My concern with $19,000 is that takes it right into, in fact, it takes it above the spec of the Panigale S, I believe, or certainly takes it very close to it. So that's not even the base spec Panigale. It's certainly more expensive than the Aprilia RSV4, which is, I know, is one of your favorites.
I'm just going to put this out there, and I'm probably going to catch holy heck for it, but come on. You can, and we talked about this in the night before, 2 nights ago. The Aprilia RSV4 is essentially a MotoGP bike that you can go into a dealership and buy, and Aprilia has been known, because they're owned by Piaggio, to be the Honda of Italian sports bikes, which says a lot. I think the one exception was the fact that their fuel tank is plastic, and it doesn't agree with the E85 ethanol as well, but Aprilia has stated as much that they would happily replace the tank if it deforms or melts or whatever the heck it does.
Yeah.
But these are, let's face it, I mean, these bikes are not daily drivers. But an RSV4R, which is about $15,000, let's say anywhere between $3,000 and $4,000 less than this incoming bike and some of the newer incoming bikes. I mean, please, I'm beside myself, really. I'm really beside myself, because, okay, if you're in a certain tax bracket, the extra few $1,000s isn't going to break you, and you'll be like, what are you crying about? It's only a few $1,000s, and if you can't afford that, then you shouldn't be looking at the blah, 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 blah. But anybody who is pinching their pennies or says, well, what kind of bike can I get? Can I get a bike that can perform within the threshold of that bike there, and for how much less?
Yeah.
Because as we know, there are a plethora of super sport and super bikes sitting at dealerships right now that are probably still in crates, and they can't move these things. And now they're putting something like this out here, and they're asking, $20,000, please.
Which is a big premium. I mean, however you look at it, that is a big premium.
I can't wrap my head around that, and I just think it's.
And
really,
that is not what the Japanese were traditionally about. They are makers of mass-produced goods. Now, I know the sales of sports bikes has depleted recently, and they don't have to stay mass-produced makers just because they were mass-produced makers before. The problem that they have is that the premium products that exist, or that are perceived as premium products, such as the Ducatis, such as perhaps the BMW S1000 or the MV Agusta, these are premium products, and at the moment, if the $19,000 price tag is correct, it can be bought cheaper than the mass-produced item, and that is a problem. I dare say that Yamaha will sell a truckload of these for the first couple of years, but I'm actually thinking longer term than that. The newness and the appeal and the people that have to have the newest, latest, greatest machine have gone. Just what are they going to sell it on the grounds of? If it's more expensive than things that are considered premium,
right?
When it is essentially a more everyday manufacturer, at least, if not machine.
Yeah. Well,
that's my say.
There you are. I mean, it's just I don't know. When I first saw the price, if that is in fact how much they're going to ask for this bike, I'm just going to say, look, you can keep it. I'd much rather have something like a Kawasaki ZX-10, really, or an Aprilia RSV4, if I'm honest. I
Yeah.
don't see justifying spending that much money on. And then you were just basically saying this is technology that they're basically bringing into the mainstream that's several or a few years old now. So we're realizing racing technology from several years ago, which is generally the case, I think, when we're talking about a lot of these super bikes or super sports.
I think it may be worth saying, and again, I probably have to reiterate that neither of us have actually ridden this bike, but there is the point worth making that there is nothing appears to be on this bike that is truly groundbreaking. Yes, it may have great electronics. Yes, it might have great electronic suspension, but they're not the first to do that. It will not necessarily be the best to do that. And so I'm just wondering on what basis are they pricing this as a premium product? And that's what I struggle to get my head around.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with you there. And it is disingenuous to, I guess, maybe to say that, yeah, to have these be casting aspersions on a bike that neither of us have actually seen in person, sat on, or ridden,
Yeah.
because this is all pure speculation.
And
But
in a couple of weeks' time, we may be raving about it.
right, but at face value, I'm going to say that $19,000 is excessive for a bike of this caliber. But and maybe I'm sure that there will probably be people that'll disagree with that.
I'm sure.
But again, one final thought or opinion, and this is something I think I'd expressed to you earlier, was that it seems to me that I'd almost be more content to say, look, if you're not going to give us anything really groundbreaking, then just give us another model year of your same stuff and knock a few $1,000s off of the price tag and start moving some of your old inventory before you bring something new to the table. Because as we had discussed before, motorcycles and particularly super sport bikes, the sales have waned, and I think that they're looking to reinvigorate. But I don't see how you can reinvigorate the market by saying, "Oh, yeah, we got a new bike, but by the way, it's several $1,000s more than the old model."
Yeah,
I mean, come
absolutely.
on.
Yeah, yeah. It's just yeah. You can't jump thousands of pounds and expect people to not comment on it. I think that is the point that both of us are essentially making. That within the framework of what we understand at the moment, it seems rather optimistic, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, on that note, that is the discussion. Just briefly making the distinction between I wonder what the price disparities will be between the S and the M model. I'm guessing that the M is probably going to be well north of $19,000 if it's coming with all carbon fiber bits and so forth.
And it is going to be a limited edition, they announced tonight as well. So that will increase the cost of it, I imagine.
With no difference in horsepower?
Well, they didn't say that specifically, but they didn't say it did have an increase in horsepower. And my suspicion is that if it had an increase, they would have trumpeted the fact.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm taking it in reverse. So in the absence of a positive, I'm taking it as a negative, and it is probably the same engine power in both, as far as we know.
Right. Well, okay, so to conclude, what we have to look forward to for the new R1 is specifications, true weight, the torque numbers I'm interested in seeing, what is the true weight of...
Spectacular. I mean, that is somewhere where this could start, we could end up doing an almost about turn on it. The torque could be great on this. Valentino Rossi was saying this evening that it pulls from virtually no revs, he said. If that is the problem is that we don't know how much he's employed by Yamaha, of course, and we don't know how much of it is factual and how much of it is marketing speak. But
And
it
then
may turn out to be a really fantastic bike, and we're going to end up having to eat our words a little bit.
probably, I would probably guess you're right. I guess just initial impressions and seeing a price that may or may not be the true MSRP of the bike. But
Yeah.
in my initial impressions of the bike were lackluster. As I begin to look at more pictures of the bike, the looks have grown on me a little bit.
I'd agree. Yeah.
And I would say that maybe until you throw your leg over the bike and actually twist the throttle, you ain't seen nothing yet, sort of thing. So
Yeah.
let's. I just say that, and apologies to any Yamaha fans that have been offended by some of our our musings and.
It's worth
and,
it's worth mentioning that Yamaha is one of my very favourite brands. They've done some fantastic things over the years, you know, and so I'm not seeking to, and I know you're not either, not seeking to knock Yamaha in any way, other than it seems optimistic what they seem to be suggesting.
Well, you know, I know there's a friend of mine who has an '09 R1. I've see him intermittently, and the one thing that really is nice about the R1 is it's not your typical. It doesn't sound like your typical inline four, and it does have the engine definitely does have character. That's one of the strong points of the bike. I've not been overly thrilled with the looks. If you could have something that sounded like an R1 and looked like an MV Agusta, I'd say you'd hit a home run.
Yeah.
And not only sounded like an R1, but also had the reliability.
Indeed. Which there is the outside possibility, which of course we've got to think about going forward in this week. There are rumours that Suzuki may bring, well, certainly the GSX-R, their MotoGP competitor. That is certainly going to be at the show later this week. But it is rumoured that they have a road bike based essentially on that is going to be the next GSX-R. And it seems to be that is an irregular firing order engine. And from what I've seen thus far, it looks spectacular. So maybe that will answer the clarion call that you mentioned. You know.
Yes. Yes. A gentleman has commented in the sidebar here that he actually likes the looks of. If we're talking about the new R1, he likes the new design. I think just the niggling thing for both of us was the placement of these two circular headlights underneath the induction cowl there, and that was really and the way they sort of kind of made the fairing, they broke up the fairing a little bit. My thought of it is if they smoothed out those lines, I think the design would have been quite a bit more appealing. At least for me, it would have been anyway.
I'd agree. I mean, if you have a look at the M1 MotoGP bike of Yamaha, I think in broad stroke terms the outline is not dissimilar to this newly released R1, but I think the details are too fussy on the R1. If it was a solid piece of obviously it would be plastic on the R1 in the same way as the same design as the M1 MotoGP bike, then I think it would. Well, certainly to my eyes, it would look much more pleasant.
I'm just going to put my head on the guillotine here and just say this new R1 is infinitely better looking than the outgoing model.
I agree. Yeah.
I think we can both agree that this new R1 is a step in the right direction in terms of looks. And
actually, in fairness, the 2009 to 2014 R1. I disliked that when I first saw it. I still am not terribly keen on it, but it has certainly grown on me over the years that it has been Yamaha's liter bike. So, this one may well grow on me too. We'll see.
Well, any other concluding thoughts? We're at 53 minutes and 45 seconds. Any outgoing thoughts? I guess we're going to wait again, just to recapitulate. We'll wait and see if $19,000 or $18,999 US dollars, that is
Yeah.
in fact going to be the actual price. Is the bike? What is the weight of the bike? What are the torque numbers of the bike?
Yeah.
Has the seat height actually been changed? Have they tapered the frame? And so these are all little detailed questions that I think I'd want to know, because being a shorter rider, approximately 5'7", both the R6 and the R1 do not entirely lend. They're really track-focused bikes just by the seating position. So those bikes generally don't lend themselves very well to the shorter rider. So I'm wondering if Yamaha has actually addressed that with this new design. From the looks of it, it looks like they have, but again, that's kind of a wait and see thing. So.
Indeed, I think perhaps if we're trying to just think of final thoughts on or other thoughts on the Yamaha, it's probably worth mentioning that the suspension manufacturer is now named themselves KYB, which is the old Kayaba, if that is the correct pronunciation. I'm sure somebody will correct us if it isn't. And it's interesting to see them. Apparently, they are going to be with Yamaha in MotoGP next year as their suspension supplier, and they also make the suspension on the new Kawasaki H2 and H2R, and are making, as I understand it, both the electronic suspension on the R1M and the standard suspension on the R1S. They've provided the suspension for Yamaha for both of those as well. So this looks like a concerted effort for KYB to get back in the motorcycle game, I think. And that's quite interesting in and of itself.
And that would certainly be a boon to people who would like to get aftermarket parts for their bike that may have a marginal, well, probably a significant difference between, let's say, someone was considering putting Öhlins forks on their bike. Would KYB, shocks or forks be an alternative, and a good alternative? So that's another thing. It seems if they're going to be providing components for MotoGP, that would bode well for them in aftermarket parts and stuff with respect to market from a marketing perspective. Anyway.
So, and I think not just in marketing. I think that they will gain, as a company, they will gain valuable R&D from being in MotoGP as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which could probably because Öhlins has been pretty much the gold standard, to use a slight play on words, but
they're a conservative lot to motorcycle racers, and so if the person that's winning is using Öhlins forks and Brembo brakes, that's what everybody wants to use.
Mm-hmm. The general, just if I could interject quickly, the gentleman, one of the viewers is made the comment. He says, perhaps what is missing for the Yamaha is the Öhlins suspension and Brembo brakes to stay on the same level as the Panigale and BMW. And what would your response be to that?
Well, that speaks to exactly what we're discussing right now. I think at the moment Öhlins and Brembo have the reputation as being the best. I think it's a well-deserved reputation, but I'm not really convinced that Showa is that far behind them. I know that Showa have struggled a little bit with Gresini in MotoGP this year, but you've got to remember there's one bike on Showa suspension, and there is 24 or 25 on Öhlins suspension. Those kind of number disparity is bound to make the Öhlins look better, because they are all giving in data to Öhlins so they can improve it, instead of just one man adding into the shower suspension.
Well, as somebody who has an Öhlins rear shock on his Triumph Street Triple, I can say with clarity and confidence that it's second to none. And the ability to be able to dial in just the way you like it, even for the road, is remarkable, and it just speaks to the quality that the company has, and the thought that they calibrate the spring to your weight and so forth, and anything. I just find it miles of improvement over the suspension, the original component that came on my bike. So Öhlins is by far really
I remember reading that some of there is original manufacturers can spend as little as $30 on one of their original equipment shock absorbers.
That's funny.
And that is very little. You know, however you look at it, that is a very little amount of money.
Quite a huge profit margin there. Anyway, we're at the top of the hour, and that thank you all for watching this segment of the EICMA discussion with the Yamaha R1S and the R1M. Thank you for watching and listening, and tune in because there's more to come.
Indeed.
Bye.
Bye-bye.